Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part 2 of an ongoing series focused on modern management, specifically client apps in Intune. The focus of today's discussion will be modern Microsoft Application Management, MAM, and under that, specifically app protection policies, and under that, specifically focused on iOS and Android. Right? So the agenda for today is essentially discussing what MAM is, why we care about it, and then looking into MAM. I want to define some terms and talk about some requirements and specific scenarios where MAM can come to play and benefit. Look through the available application protection policies. Look through various Enlightened, as we call them, apps. Do a walkthrough, actually let you see MAM in action, wind up with a bit of troubleshooting tips and tricks, and we will be done. So what exactly is MAM? So MAM, again, Microsoft Application Management. What this does is it specifically will protect company data at the application level versus at the device level, right? It's a suite of Intune management features that will specifically allow administrators to publish, push, configure, secure, monitor, update mobile apps being used in your environment. So management here, again, targeted to the app instead of to the device running the app, right? So that enables a couple of interesting scenarios we'll talk about in a minute. So why MAM, right? Well, MAM is targeted. Again, policies are only applied when working in a work or corporate context and are bypassed if an app is being used in a personal context. Security, protecting organizational data whenever it's being used within an app. When apps are used without restrictions, then company and personal data can get intermingled. It can get to be a mess, and so having ways to deal with that are very helpful. Lightweight, so again, application versus device focused. So I'll go ahead and say this. I'll mention it again, but I'm kind of feeling I need to go ahead and say this. So MAM is application focused. It does not mean that you can't use MAM when you manage the device. So to say it another way, you can use MAM to manage the application whether a device is enrolled in Intune or MDM or not. But if that device is enrolled in Intune or MDM, then you can still use MAM. It's just a matter of realizing that MAM specifically is managing the application, whereas something like Intune is about managing the device. And more on that in a minute. I'll cover a couple of scenarios, but wanted to mention that here. All right. So defining terms for MAM. So again, MAM, Microsoft Application Management. This again, solution about managing individual applications. Then we have application protection policies, which you will also hear about. So the application protection policies are policies targeted specifically to enable management of individual apps. These are rules to ensure organizational data remains safe, remains contained in the managed application. Rules are enforced when the user attempts to access or move corporate data, or it's basically a set of actions that are prohibited, monitored when the user's inside the app, right? So then we have application configuration policies. Application configuration policies are policies targeted to enable configuration of individual applications. So let me pause there for a minute. So MAM, Microsoft Application Management, is the umbrella term that describes all of what you can do through application protection policies and application configuration policies. So the session today is not going to focus on application configuration policies at all. It's going to focus on application protection policies and specifically look at iOS and Android. We'll do Windows in a separate session. You'll understand why in a minute. I'll explain it. But really want to hone in on the iOS and Android experience for this session. And then last is MAM-we. So what that means is Microsoft Application Management without enrollment, right? And so that leads us into a couple of scenarios. Well, we'll get to the scenarios in a minute. Sorry, I forgot we have the requirement slide. So the requirements do have a little bit of difference between the platforms. So iOS and Android, we do need what's called an enlightened application. Explain that more in a minute. We need iOS 10 or better. I saw a document when I was looking around that said iOS 8 or better. We no longer support anything less than iOS 10, so it's iOS 10 or better, Android 4.4 or better. With Windows, and again, we're not going to dig into Windows in this session, but I will show you a couple of things kind of leading to the Windows discussion. On Windows, there's no specific requirement for an app to be re-engineered in order to support MAM. It can happen with any application. That bears a little bit of discussion. Here's what I'll get back into it, say it again. What do I mean by enlightened application? So specifically for iOS and Android, if we're going to do MAM, we need an application that supports the different controls that we might want to implement on the app. That's called an enlightened app. There's a couple of different ways to obtain enlightened apps that I'll talk about, but the app essentially has a wrapper around it that will be able to work with the controls and things that we put on it. So back to Windows, again, none of that is required. You can have a Windows 32-bit app, desktop app, store app, whatever, and we can support all of them, right? You can have protection policies for Notepad. In fact, that's one of the default applications that you can configure if you want to, right? And then Intune Company Portal. So this is required on any device to receive app protection policies specifically on Android. This is not required to be logged into, but it is required to be installed in order to have those capabilities. Now, a couple of scenarios, 3 really. Right? Scenario 1, this was the MAM without enrollment. So what are the requirements? You do need Intune. You also need MAM, which that is part of Intune. Here, you don't need any MDM enrollment at all. Now, there's limitations when you don't have MDM enrollment. You can't deploy apps to devices. You can't provision certificates. You can't do Wi-Fi and VPN settings. Basically, you can't manage the device. You just manage the supported apps running on the device. But that's a perfectly fine scenario if you want to do that. Why might you want to do that? Well, so MAM without enrollment, it could be for a variety of reasons. It might be user experience. Maybe the corporate culture is one where the users don't want their devices to be managed. Maybe the users only need access to select apps. Maybe you have a consultant that is in the organization or in the business for a short time, and you want to manage their control to a specific app, but not their device. Could be compliance. Maybe the company wants to have limited management responsibilities, right? Maybe you want just conditional access plus MAM, right? Different things, right? You can create your own scenario there, or your own reasons there, but that's maybe a few. Scenario 2, here we might have a device that is enrolled in a third-party non-Intune based MDM management platform, but you still will need Intune to implement MAM only. Right? We fully support third-party MDM enrollment and MAM working side by side. Scenario 3 would be where you have Intune. You have MAM because you have Intune, and you have full MDM enrollment, and that works fine as well. Okay, now, here you see basically available application protection policies. This is at a high level. Right? And I won't read to you what's on the slide. You can see yourself. Essentially, iOS and Android are very similar in what they provide. A couple of differences, right? But so these are at a high level, and there's definitely subcategories under each bullet as to what you can do and what you will do. And we'll see some of that actually vetted out as we go through the console here in just a bit. So now we have enlightened applications. So I have a list of available enlightened applications as of the time I'm recording this. So again, an enlightened application is one that has a wrapper around it that will support the management capabilities that MAM provides. Yeah, this is unique to iOS and Android, right? That's why this session is really focusing on iOS and Android. Windows is not that way. We'll have a separate session on Windows. So we have Microsoft apps that are all engineered and ready to go for MAM control. We have partner apps that are out there. But you may look at this list and say, well, that's great, and I'll use some of that, right? Oh, and by the way, before I move on, notice the asterisk by the Intune Managed Browser. The Intune Managed Browser is certainly one that has these controls. Edge is now at parity with Intune Managed Browser. And so Edge is the one really you should probably be focusing on as you go forward. I don't know if we're going to continue to develop Intune Managed Browser or not. Certainly Edge is one that we will. So FYI. But if you look at this list and think, well, that's great, but I have my own apps that don't have any wrapping around them to support MAM, but I really would like to support MAM. So your line of business apps, you can absolutely initiate where you can build those to support MAM. Now, I'm not going to get into the specific details because they get to a different level of where I want to be in this discussion. But really, there's three ways. You can use the Intune app SDK. So this is available for both iOS and Android. And the SDK will enable you to support app protection policies, to wrap effectively your app and support app protection policies. The app wrapping tool for iOS, this one is specific to iOS. Here, the tool uses a Mac OS, so you need a Mac of some sort. It's a Mac OS command line application that will create a wrapper around your app without changing the code of the app itself at all. Right? So very easily, you can take an existing app and make it MAM capable. And similarly for Android, here it's just a Windows command line tool that will work to wrap Android applications. Right? So yeah, we have the ones that are immediately available in the store that are in Enlightened that you can use, but we have a whole lot more capability if you have line of business you want to support yourself. Okay, so I want to walk you through and show you a few things about MAM. And this will be in relation to how to set up to manage apps and so on. So we'll do a walkthrough. One thing that I didn't put in the PowerPoint slide, but I do want to talk to you about, is also about how you enable MAM support, or where you want to go in the console for MAM support. Let me pull in the Azure portal. First place I'm going to go is Azure Active Directory. All right, and so if I go under Azure Active Directory and look down under MDM, or Mobility, MDM, and MAM, here I have Intune. And so basically you have a choice to make. What is your MDM user scope? What users, or which users are going to be managed by MDM? In my case, all of them, right? And then which users are going to be managed by MAM? And so in my case, I put all of them as well. So you can tweak this a bit if you want to set up a scenario where you don't have a device enrolled in Intune, but you do have users managed by MAM. You can create that, right? So whenever I set up my device, I had to make sure that it wasn't enrolled in Intune and so on, right? So especially on the Windows side, if this MDM user scope includes users that are all, like I have right now, or the specific user group, then we will go ahead and automatically enroll that Windows device in Intune. So I didn't want that. I had to set up my Windows device by first setting this to none and so on. But you see, right? So these are the URLs. And to use MAM with Windows, you're going to have to make sure to restore the default URLs and such. We'll get into that in the Windows session, but wanted to show that to you. So back to Intune. So I want to walk through specifically the iOS and Android options settings. I'll also show you Windows while we're here, and we'll dig into that more in another session, but under Client Apps. So I have app protection policies. I also have app configuration policies. Again, we're not going to talk about this in this session. We'll talk just about this app protection policies, and specifically iOS and Android. So you see that I have Edge for iOS. I have Excel for iOS. I have Word for iOS. And so we're going to be focusing in the demo on iOS. But what we're going to see in a minute is, or what we're going to see on iOS basically is going to translate over to Android very similarly. So not going to do Android in the demo that's coming up, but just know it's the same experience. I also have Notepad and IE set up here for Windows. I don't know, I may change that whenever we get to the actual Windows session, but that's what I have set up to demo and to play with, right now. So let's go and pretend we don't have anything created at all. I'm just going to go create a new policy and just walk through. So I can give it a name. I don't really care. I'm not going to save this. Basically, I'm going to select a platform. So iOS, Android, and Windows 10. Those are our three. So I'm going to choose iOS and then basically target to all app types. So what does that specifically mean? Use this option to target your policy to apps on devices of any management state. Or I can say no. And then I will have to say what type. Apps on unmanaged devices, apps on Intune managed devices. Those are my choices. So in my case, I'm just leaving that to yes because it's easier. And I'm going to select the required apps. So you have already, that list I showed you before, that's what you're seeing here. And so you can choose one app, you can choose all apps, 3 apps, 4 apps, whatever you want, right? And then go ahead and select those. You may want to configure your apps all as a unit. That's fine. Or you may want to implement different settings on different apps depending. That's fine. However you do it. I'm just going to hit select here. And now that I have the app selected that I want to manage, I'm going to look at my default settings. So I showed you a minute ago, let me pull this back out, go back a little bit. So I showed you the settings, the data transfer, encryption, functionality, so on. So you'll see some of those tags here as we go along. All right, so here's the data protection and so on. So if I look in data protection, then I have a number of settings under here, such as, hey, do I want to allow the organizational data to be stored in iTunes or iCloud backups? Probably not, right? So you can block that. Do you want to allow apps to share data, to be able to send organizational data, and so on? So you can say every app, or you can make choices within this and say only policy managed apps, only policy apps with sharing turned off, whatever you want, right? So this one is one that a lot of people select. If you have an exemption, you can choose that. Retrieve data from other apps. Do you want to absorb data from any other apps? How do you want to do that? Again, similar, kind of list, right? Do you want to allow saving copies of org data? Do you want to restrict copy and paste? You want to block it altogether or allow policy managed apps or whatever? Do you want to enforce encryption? It is required by default. Other functionality. Do you want to be able to print org data? Do you want to restrict web content transfer? Unmanaged browser passwords, protocols, and so on, right? All that's in there. And then you move on down, access requirements. So what do you want here, right? So this is where you would go set up a PIN. PIN is required. What kind of PIN? Simple PIN. Do you want to increase to a greater number of characters that are required, and so on, right? All the way down. So we can just set what we want there. On we go. So conditional launch. What do you want? Do you want to set a max number of PIN attempts? Do you want to set a different offline grace period, offline grace period here in what you want to do, and so forth? Device conditions, minimum OS versions. Do you want to allow jailbroken or rooted devices? And on we go there, right? And then this last one, not really a ton to show. Scope tags don't really have anything defined there, right? But you can hit OK and save it, and we're done. Now, again, I don't care about this. I've got one already for Edge, and the others are similar, so I can go back in and look at my properties. And so I've set a few things in here in terms of blocking different things and so forth, right? I can go back. I've set a PIN requirement of, I think, 8 characters, that we will see in just a minute, right? So 8 characters. So I've got a few that are actually already set up. So that's kind of walking through what's available for iOS and Android. While I'm here, I'm going to show you the Windows policy and explain a little bit why we're going to have a separate session to kind of walk through it. So I'm going to do this and select platform, Windows. So immediately I get to choose, do I want to go without enrollment or with enrollment? So without enrollment, you had a little box there. Let me show it to you. Talking about making sure the MAM URLs are set to default and so on to support that. So I'll just leave that alone. And now you choose, like before, protected apps. What apps do you care about? So you can add apps, and the main ones, the default ones, recommended ones, if you will come up. You can filter by store apps. You can do desktop apps so on. So the filter accordingly and fill this in, and how you want to do this. And so this is getting more into the customization. We go back to recommended apps. So these are apps that are already filled in for you, right? And so you'll notice that these are designated as store apps or desktop apps or app locker files and whatever. And you see things like Notepad and also IE and O365 and the equivalent mobile versions of the Word, the Office apps up here, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, whatever. So these are the recommended ones. So if I want to take one of the recommended ones, it's pretty easy to start to go configure this. If I want to import my own, so like this one, Action, Allow, right? I really can't change this, but if I want to go in and configure something unique for store apps, well, then I do have some ability to allow or deny that app or whatever the case may be and put this in, and similar for desktop apps and so forth, right? So I'm going to go away from that, and I'm just going to add an app, and I'm just going to choose one desktop app. I'll just use IE, right? Hit OK. And so the next one, from there, I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to have to go configure advanced settings. And so in here is where you will do things like add a network boundary or decide proxy servers and IP ranges and data protection and all these settings, right? And the very top, you will notice, actually let me configure required settings here. The very top, one of the things you'll notice is that this is driven through Windows information protection. And that is the reason that I want to do a separate session on the Windows portion. Because even though it's MAM, right, it's really being driven through Windows information protection. There's a lot of things you can do in here. I mentioned that any app on your Windows device, you can apply this policy to. There's ways you apply the policy. There's ways that you import and deal with store apps and that you deal with desktop apps and so on and so on. So I want to show that to you in a separate session. So I'm introducing the topic here, but we'll actually get into it in the next session, specifically focused on Windows. All right. Now, I want to show this to you in action, okay? So again, I'm going to do this demo on an iOS device, but it's the same, effectively, with Android. So I'm going to show you, let's pull back in the console here. And if I go over to Devices, this is going to be MAM without enrollment. If I go over to Devices, you are not going to see my iOS device registered. So I'm going to look at all devices. Here's definitely an iPad registered, but it's the only one that's registered. This is not iOS device at all. It's test, just to make sure, under properties. I think it's properties. Yeah, this is a Windows device, so it's just called test. So there's no other iOS device in here. There is an iPad, but I'm using an iPhone for this test, right? Now, I want to install a couple of apps here. Let me just go ahead and launch my screen sharing for my iPhone and screen mirroring, yes. So let's get that going. And so pop that up, right? I'm just going to install a couple of apps just so you can see me do it. I know installing apps is boring, but let's just go do it. And so App Store. And I'm going to install Word. Because I have 3 there. I have Word, Excel, and Edge. So I'm going to go ahead and get that, start that downloading. All right, and then I'm going to go get Excel. And start that, downloading. Go get it from the cloud. And then I'm going to go get Edge. All right, so go get that and download that from the cloud. And we'll see if I go over here, all 3 of those are in the process of loading. So I'll wait for just a minute while they load and I'll come right back. Okay, so I have all three apps installed. Let me go ahead and pull this out for just a minute. I have not launched these at all. These are completely fresh installs. And so just to go back through, I've already shown you this, but just to go back through for a minute, go to Client Apps, and then specifically App Protection Policies. And so what I have, and it's the same for all three, I'll show you Edge, right, under my properties. I have a couple of things. Under data protection, I have configured specifically to block sharing to iTunes iCloud. We're not going to see all this. I'm just showing you what I have, and have a few other things. Copy and paste is blocked, and so forth, right? If I go back, then I do have a requirement for an 8-digit, 8-character PIN that you will see in just a minute, right? So let me go and pull my iOS device back in. And so it disconnected screen sharing. There we go. Let me put this back in. All right, good enough. So what I want to do now is I want to launch. One thing I didn't show you. Let me bring that back in here. Let's pull that back. So I've got my policy created, but I have to assign it. So I assign it to a group of users. So my user group is called MAM. It has one account in it, mine, my main account that I use for testing in my lab. But this is a user-based group. MAM does apply to a groups-based, populated with users, right? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to launch Word and Excel. And I'm not going to get very far because I don't have my Office 365 configuration set up in my lab right now, but you'll at least see one part of this. So notice this screenshot down here. It won't be exactly like this, but the idea is whenever I launch this, again, you see no company portal on here at all, indicating enrollment, right? It's just here. So this is without enrollment in Intune, but when I launch these apps, they're going to go check in and realize they are now managed and immediately tell me that we need to have them managed. Let me launch Word. So Word's going to come up, and it's going to take me to my precursor screens like normal and say getting started, and that's great, and hey, not now for that, that's great, and I'm going to click on View, and that's great. So we're launching, and so very quickly here, we should get a prompt to say exactly this. Your org is now protecting data in the app. You need to restart the app to continue. And so I have to restart, no choice. And so what's happening in the back end is this app is being reconfigured to require MAM management tools to be activated. So I'll launch it again, and I open up a blank document, and notice at the very top, and this is where it's not going to let me go any further, this account does not allow editing on your device for an account, blah, 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 sign in. And that's where I don't have my Office 365 stuff linked in, so I'll go ahead and get rid of that. Excel is going to show me exactly the same kind of thing, where it's going to tell me immediately once I get to the screens that I need to be managed. So we'll let it do that, and then we'll restart the app, and there we go. And so great, I'm going to restart Excel, and I'm going to get the same experience, just as you saw in Word, that I have to deal with the user account. So those two clearly being managed by MAM, but also clearly not letting me get anywhere because I don't have my association with Office 365. That's why I'm choosing Edge as well, right? So I'm going to launch Edge. And so right away, similar kind of thing, it's going to go through and say, hey, this app is managed. So what do I want to sign in with? So here's my long sign-in information for my environment. So I'm going to click on it and say, yeah, I don't care. But again, organization is protecting the app, have to restart it, great. So I'm restarting it, and I'm going to launch it again. Well, I say I'm going to launch it again. Let's go back over here and launch it again. All right. Now, notice, to access your organization's data with this app, enter your PIN. So this is something that I have set up already. I've already done this with Edge, so as I recall, my PIN for this might be 11. I actually think I forgot what it was, but it's an 8-digit PIN, and that's why, yeah. So that's why it's being enforced. But, yeah, we could go through and we could show you all the copy and paste stuff, but you get the idea. this is actually working the way that it was set up and adhering to the pin and all of that, right? Okay, so some other cool stuff here. Having the MAM configuration set up and deployed and so forth is great, but people want to be able to see the effect of their configurations. And so let's pull back in the Intune console. There's a couple of places that we can go. So under the client apps setting here, right, still under client apps, if we scroll down further, there's the app protection status node. And this is interesting because it will show you, my lab is boring, but it will show you the details for any flagged users, users with potentially difficult situations, assigned users, so that's still loading. User status for iOS, so I have one managed by policy, one user. Again, my lab kind of boring. Nothing for Android. Here are the top protected apps. So there's Edge, Excel, and Word, and I don't have any for Android. And then there's the app configuration, which we're not talking about in the session. So these dashboards all by themselves are very helpful. So here you see this finally populated one assigned user. So these dashboards are very helpful to see at a glance what's actually going on, right? But that may not be enough, right? You might want to go a little bit deeper. So if you notice, there's this reports section. And so there's also the app protection report for iOS that you can download and be able to look at. And so we'll look at that as soon as it's downloaded. Let me pause while it finishes. Okay, so it finished populating. So I'm going to go ahead and save the report. And instead of saving it, I'm just going to open it. And so we are opening the report. And here it comes. And so again, just have users and the devices and what's actually happening. Here's Excel, Word, and Edge, right? So just this would be a much more useful report if it were a more interesting lab. But you see, we can do that. There's also reports here that we can run. And so we'll have a user report here where we can see what's going on with an individual user. Again, me is just one user here that I do everything with. So I'll select myself. And the report will load and show what's going on with me and so forth. I can go back and look at the per app report if I want to. So this might be for iOS and the app itself, Edge, and my status of protected. And so it's loading, and I do see that there's one user, me, that has it reported. Here's the configuration and other stuff that really is not applicable for what we're doing. Here is more for app configuration data and so on. And so then we have other reporting options, such as being able to use the Graph API, which is beyond the scope of our discussion now. Also the Power BI dashboards to be able to get information and so on to help you with your reporting. So let me get rid of that for a minute. Okay. So the other part of this is one of the cool things about using MAM specifically for the app is that you can selectively wipe data from the app. So if you're needing to, if a user's leaving the company or whatever the case may be, and you want to wipe any corporate data from the app, it's pretty easy to set up a wipe request. And so if I just go over to the main page again and look at App Selective Wipe, then I can go create a wipe request. And so maybe I just want to wipe the data for one user, which is what I want to do here, right? And then I want to wipe any kind of data on that device specifically that is protected. So I'm going to load, and I'll see my device populate here in just a second. And so here it is, my iPhone right here. So I'm going to create, I'm going to select that, and it's going to create an app selective wipe request for that device. So sending wipe request to my device, right? And it's creating it now. Again, I can download reports and so on. So while it's creating, let me go ahead and get my device back connected. All right, wait for the request to be completed. Okay, and you see that the wipe requests are out here for all three of the managed apps on my device, and they're pending state right now. right? And so left alone, this would go ahead and process through. Let's see if it's actually made it to the device. It may or may not have been. Let me go ahead and launch Word. And so Word is doing its thing, you know, whatever, like normal. Let's see what happened to the wipe request behind the scenes, if anything so far. Let's refresh for that. And the wipe request comes up, and as soon as we get it loaded, so I refreshed it, didn't actually do anything yet. I'm going to go ahead and launch Excel and see. Sometimes it takes just a short amount of time to get these requests processed. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then the point is, by launching these apps, let me pull this back out of the way. I'll refresh it again, see if I'm lucky or not. And if not, that's fine. I'll just move on. But by doing this, so yeah, it's still doing this pending situation. That's fine. This will process through in just a minute. But it's really that easy to initiate an app selective wipe on the device, and you can speed it along. You know, once everything's settled, by launching the app, it should go ahead and take care of it, no issue. Now, as we start to wrap up, some troubleshooting tips and tricks. There's a number of frequently asked questions at this URL. There's no way I would try to reproduce all of these because it is a list that is kind of fluid and added to all the time. But here are some of the big headers that you will see. App protection or protective features. This is going to include questions about what happens with wipes, how they work, and so on. I do want to show you one thing that's in the console specifically for helping you troubleshoot. This is not specific to apps, app protection policies, MAM, that sort of thing. It's just a general good thing to know. So let me go back into Intune and scroll down. There's a troubleshooting section right here, which is useful. And so I can select a user to troubleshoot. So I'll select again my user. And then we'll load information specific to this particular user. Again, not just MAM related, certainly does have the MAM stuff in here. We can see that these are all the devices I have. I use the same user account for everyone, and so on. So that's, again, kind of a very useful way to see what specifically is going on in the environment for a user, and at least take the first step toward troubleshooting. All right, and with that, that's what I wanted to show you. In this session, we will have another couple coming up. Again, one to deal with Windows information protection version of MAM specifically, and then we'll also deal with the application configuration profiles or policies and so on. And so we will wrap this session here, and we'll see you next time.